Chairman, we're now live.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome to tonight's Corporate Finance and Property Select Committee meeting. A warm welcome to those attending and to our viewers watching live on the Council's YouTube channel, which is Hillingdon, London. My name is Councillor Richard Mills and I am Chairman of tonight's meeting. Ahead of the meeting this evening, as a committee, we will pause for a minute's silence to reflect on the current events within Ukraine. Thank you, everybody. Looking ahead to tonight's meeting, details of the business to be considered are shown on the agenda, copies of which are available in the room and also accessible online under the live broadcast. For those present in the room, when you wish to speak, can I remind you that you'll be filmed and any statements you make will be recorded and made public. Further reminder that when speaking, your voice will only be audible if the microphone is switched on, and a reminder to turn it off when you have finished speaking. We're not expecting a fire drill this evening, so if the alarm does go off, please follow officers to the nearest exits out of the building and onto the designated meeting points. Before we move on to the agenda, I just want to introduce the councillors and officers present with us this evening. So starting on my right, Councillor Harangi, Councillor Lewis, Councillor Tuckwell and Councillor Tubadar, and on my left, Councillor Edgington and Councillor Bliss. In terms of officers this evening, we're joined by Kevin Byrne, the Head of Health and Strategic Partnerships. Via video link, Emma Gilbertson, the Head of Corporate Communications, and our Democratic Services Officer this evening is Liz Penny. This brings us on to the main agenda for the meeting. So agenda item 1 is apologies for absence.
Apologies have been received from Councillor Raymond Graham, with Councillor Steve Tuckwell substituting.
Thank you very much, and thank you for stepping in to substitute. Agenda item 2, any declarations of interest coming before us this evening? No, I see no indications. Agenda item 3 is to agree the minutes from the meeting dated the 2nd of February. Anyone have any comments on those? Councillor Edgington?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, there's really a point about the work programme and the resolution there that we would be seeking the update regarding, or an update regarding the HOAC construction project. I know that something's been received by Ms. Penny, and I'd just like to confirm that I understand that the scheme has not been finalised, therefore officers are not in a position to update the committee at this stage. Well, that was the whole point of my asking for a review, because it's the fact that no progress seems to be made for the last 4 years. And quite honestly, bearing in mind that my estimate is that it's cost the council £5 million so far, and potentially the total amount which is being offered by HS2 is at risk, which is about £26.5 million, is a bit worrying. And I wonder whether we could try and at least find out what's happening, and if necessary ask the cabinet member responsible to come along and explain, please.
Thank you, Liz. I think we can take that back to officers and see firstly what they believe in terms of update is possible, or at least to provide, rather than saying there is no update, to provide an update in terms of progress or the lack of progress that Councillor Edgington has described, if that's okay. With that, we're happy to agree the rest of the minutes. Thank you. Agenda item 4 is to confirm that all items before us this evening are part 1 and will therefore be held in public. And that takes us to agenda item 5. Kevin, thank you for joining us. So this is looking In terms of one of the past reviews we did under this committee, or under its previous name as a policy overview committee, it was a review into the voluntary sector response into the COVID-19 pandemic. Kevin, thank you for joining us tonight to be able to give us an update in terms of those recommendations that the committee presented to Cabinet, those recommendations that were approved by Cabinet, to understand how have they been able to be implemented and what has been achieved from those since.
Okay, I'll start with perhaps a general overview as to where I see things now. What I should say is that what I haven't done is to go back to any of the witnesses you saw in compiling your report. So I haven't done a sort of a survey or a canvas of the groups themselves, but we do have regular contact with most of the organisations, H4All and the food banks. So I have a fair feel for, I think, where they've got to, and we are in regular dialogue with them. But this is sort of my opinion, I think, rather than their feedback as to where they see the current situation in relation to COVID. And what's most stark, I think, at the moment, rather than where we were when we first looked at the committee's review, is that the emphasis then was very much on food supply and making sure that those who needed urgent and emergency food were able to access it, because they were required to isolate for various reasons, whether they were clinically extremely vulnerable or because they'd actually contacted COVID. That has moved on markedly since, as you may feel anyway in your communities. But where we're at now is that the focus in terms of our work with the voluntary sector is very much about promoting what is now the front line of defence against COVID, which is to take up the vaccines. And we're putting in a lot of effort in working with our voluntary sector partners to encourage those who are hesitant about taking up vaccines to do so. We're putting in some focused effort with our partners, H4All, to recruit people from within communities who may be better placed to deliver those messages. And that project I'll come on to is called Community Champions. That's not to say that the food banks have they are still very busy, and there is still a level of need out there that is still demanding for them. But what it's enabled them to do is to move back to, certainly the Hillingdon Food Bank, to move back to the operating model that it had before COVID. So rather than needing to deliver food to people, they've gone back to the voucher system that they had before, where professionals are able to refer people to the food bank, who then get a voucher, an e-voucher usually, and go to one of their distribution sites to collect food on an emergency basis when they need it. And that model is the one that the Trussell Trusts have established for food banks that come under their banner, which the two main ones in Hillingdon Food Bank and the UB7 Food Bank do. So they're sort of back to that operating model, and although demand is still high, it's much lower than it was during the period of various periods of lockdown and needing to provide the urgent food for people who just couldn't get out of their house, basically for those reasons. The community hub we asked about has evolved to respond to some of the newer challenges that are out there, still supporting people who are homeless and have no recourse to public funds. That's been an ongoing role, and I can come on to tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. What your recommendation 3 was in relation to the voluntary sector and ongoing support for the voluntary sector, and at the December Cabinet, it was the core grants programme for 2022-23 was agreed, and that is now published, and there is over £2 million worth of expenditure there that will go into the voluntary sector over the course of the next year to support delivery of services, to provide support and guidance, and to hopefully increase resilience in the voluntary sectors to support our communities. So that was, I'll go through sort of one or two of the points that I've made in the paper in relation to our current programmes and the sort of response that we've been working with the voluntary sector on. The Community Champions programme I mentioned is something we started at the beginning of 2021 with H4All, and we were fortunate enough to have a little bit of money from government to kick this off and to fund it, and it became clear to us fairly early on that we needed to establish some very clear routes into engaging and communicating with different communities. there was mixed messaging going around about all of the issues to do with COVID, but more lately that's focused on vaccines. But right in the early days, should we lock down? What do we need to do? Those questions were coming forward. So we set up a network of about 200 individuals who were representing local community groups, faith venues, residents associations, all sorts of different groups that had volunteered to come forward and to engage with us. So we had online meetings with them right from the beginning of 2021 on a monthly basis to commence that dialogue and to develop more of a rapport and understanding. And that proved invaluable, really, in being able to understand what the messages were that were coming back from communities about why there may be confusion about vaccine take-up and other things to do with COVID. We were able to develop that from that, a program of recruiting a specific number of 30 community champions who have gone through a training process and committed to working with us and H for All to deliver those messages around health on an ongoing basis. And we've now just had another round of money agreed by the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, which will allow us to extend that through this year. And we're hoping to recruit another 40 champions from our network of communities. Those people will work alongside an outreach team that we are employing in the council, again using the money from DLUC, to challenge and reach out into communities where we know there has been lower vaccine take-up, and that covers two areas really. It covers geographies. We know that there are 10 areas we've chosen which are described as lower super output areas. They're basically sub-ward areas that will cover about 1,500 population, but small geographies. So we've looked at those areas where there's lowest take-up. We've also looked at some of the communities where there is lowest take-up. So we know that within our Pakistani communities, Bangladeshi, Black African, mostly Somalian, but also white Eastern European communities, that there is a lower take-up. So we're encouraging, through our community groups and the work with H for All, contact into those groups where we can, and we're working with our outreach teams to promote vaccine take-up in those lower super output areas, the 10 of them around the borough, during the course of this month. We've employed the transporter bus, which is used in the youth service usually, but we've used it now for vaccine take-up. It was in Hayes on Monday. Last Friday, I think it was down at Bell Farm in West Drayton usually. It's been to Harefield, it's been to Brunel, it's been to various places, and we plan for it to go through those 10 areas. So we've got that sort of flexible facility to deploy to try and encourage people to just understand what the situation is in terms of taking up vaccines. So that's the program we're putting most of our attention in at the moment in terms of community champions. The food banks, as I say, are still providing a valuable service, and we've worked with Hillingdon Food Bank to support them to look again at their operating model and how they can increase donations and levels of volunteers to support them. I also know that the UB7 Food Bank has extended its operations into Heathrow villages and into parts of Hayes, so they're able to cover a slightly wider geography too. So that is going well. It's not without its challenges, but I don't think we're in the position we were once, where it was all about making sure that people who couldn't get out of their home were getting food. My understanding now is that the referral rates are much lower than they were before, and we're back to that sort of more of a business as usual system, which is working well. In terms of the community hub, is now based at Ruislip Young People Centre. The call line is through to our contact centre, so it's the council number still, but the team is based at Ruislip, and they are still delivering food where needed, particularly to homeless families who were part of the Everybody In programme originally. That number is down to about 25, I understand. It was up to over 100 at one stage. But there is still a residual need there. Alongside that, the team who have managed PPE and are delivering that through to a number of our offices, as well as local hotels and other establishments where it's needed. So they've extended their role to cover a number of different functions, and I think the question for us moving forward will be, well, how do we need that longer term, and how do we perhaps manage down some of those services so they become more business as usual as well. But the hub at the moment is still up and running and doing a good job, and it was able therefore to provide a sort of a provider of last resort whenever we've needed it. So there was a period over Christmas where different versions of whether we were actually in lockdown, but where there were restrictions, and certainly people were reluctant to go out, and there were, at that stage, the food bank was not open between Christmas and New Year, so I know they delivered a few emergency food parcels because there was a need that was identified through our community hub, so that's still providing a valuable service. In terms of the voluntary and community sector development, more generally, we are picking up from groups that they are struggling as a result of having to adjust. A lot of the focus has been on COVID recovery, and if your voluntary sector group is not necessarily primarily delivering COVID recovery, then you may find that you're not necessarily eligible for particular grants and support. So I think our programme for next year is an important intervention to support the wide breadth of voluntary groups in Hillingdon. There are a number of activities still that are important as we come out of COVID to look at recovery and how the voluntary sector can support that, around food supply we mentioned, but also physical mental health, issues to do with social isolation and domestic abuse are coming through as concerns for the communities. We're picking up that a number of residents who may have seen their social network through the voluntary sector prior to COVID, there is still a lack of confidence with some groups to come out and engage and be involved. So I know our older people's dining centres, one or two of them are still struggling to go back to normal in terms of the volume of people that were being supported. They do keep in regular contact with their clients and still delivering a very valuable job, but the numbers have not gone back up to where they were. And as a result of being in isolation, we're picking up that there are some sort of physical deteriorations that are available that we may know through groups, and anxiety about what the future variants or impacts would be. It's interesting that I wrote this before the latest government announcements, which was sort of taken us another stage further in terms of living with COVID, I think is the phrase that's used, to see how people are reacting to that, and whether we're on a clear trajectory to back to normal and whatever that might look like. I know my public health colleagues will probably say that it's not over. There is still COVID out there, and we need to be vigilant, and people need to take their own precautions. So therefore, that messaging is getting across to the voluntary sector to help support, understanding within our communities, and using faith leaders and others to be able to pass those messages on through people that they trust and understand, rather than from sort of officialdom, if you like, which sometimes doesn't always deliver the same impact. Moving forward, I think one of the things we have picked up is that we know there is a backlog in health services, elective surgery, etc. That will be a challenge in terms of people's health and accessing to health. The use of digital interventions, being able to go online and do virtually anything over the COVID period, has meant that some people have become quite reliant and comfortable with that, and maybe reluctant to go back to more physical or outgoing activities. We also know that in that process there are a number of disparities in terms of people that don't have access to digital routes, and one of the projects we did support in the last round of grants is a project with H4All led by Age UK to look at how we can support some of those groups. They're going to look at who are digitally excluded, for want of a better word, and how we might be able to work with other organisations. Vodafone, for example, have a charitable arm where they're supporting communities. So we'll try to access support through that to see what can actually be done to help people be able to participate in digital services, and what it might take to do that across a number of different spheres. So that, I think, is where we are in terms of the update. On the priorities that were set by the committee in its report, the first, I think, was acknowledging and appreciating that we'd responded to the voluntary sector, so I think that's taken as a sort of a given. Hillingdon for All and the hub is still operating and has moved on from strength to strength. We've announced a new round of grants for the voluntary sector. We have featured in Hillingdon People on recommendation 4, in each publication there is a section on the voluntary sector, where we will promote services and assist groups to recruit volunteers or expertise they may need, promote what they do. So I think that's been picked up as well. I think that probably covers all I've got to say. So I'm happy to take any questions from the committee.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Happy to take any questions. Councillor Tuckwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Kevin, for the report that you've just taken us through. Just one area that you mentioned was around mental health. So I'd be really interested if you could just expand a little bit in sort of what the voluntary sector is doing to address the concerns you've highlighted in the report, and how we're supporting those organisations.
Yeah, I mean, what we know from organisations like Mind is that the demand for their services has gone through the roof, basically, and they are. I don't want to say they're struggling, because that suggests they're not coping, because I think they are coping, and they've done well, and we've supported them. So in recent years, we've given them more in terms of core grant to support them. We do work with them quite closely to make sure that they're able to respond to what's there. So. But there are pressures there, and in fact, you interviewed mine, and I think you heard that as part of the report. So, and that has not changed. There is still the same demand that's reflected in the original report. Is still there. We are working with. I mean, what we're doing as officers is working with our partners in mental health services to try and look at the crisis pathway to make sure that is working as effectively as possible. I don't know you have an interest, Councillor. And we pick it up, and other groups like Samaritans who are doing a valuable job. We don't give them a lot of money because we don't need to, because they actually function very well. But they similarly are seeing demand in a way that they hadn't seen before. So we are. They know we're here. They know we can work with them, and we're making sure that as best we can that they are delivering services for residents in whatever way they can.
Councillor Lewis.
Better. Kevin, you spoke about the food banks and about the vaccination service. Are we statistically tracking who is coming so that we can actually find where the voids are in our communications?
We've got some excellent data on vaccine take-up. So we're able to work with the NHS and partners to pinpoint exactly where the levels are. So we know based on age, ethnicity, and geography, roughly we know fairly clearly what the vaccine take-ups are in those areas. So we can then target what our intervention and support needs to be to help those people get back to take up the vaccines if they so choose. So we work with the NHS. The NHS, through the GPs and what they call primary care networks, the local neighbourhood teams who are working on all of this, are proactively contacting people who they know from their records have not had vaccines to encourage them to take up the vaccine. It's still voluntary, so there's no. This is not about strong-armed or anything like that. It's about just trying to understand why people may have some reluctance, if they have, what that might be, and if those fears can be allayed, then to encourage them to take up the vaccine. So. That's where that work is at the moment. It's about it's very much intelligence led. So where we're going and what we're doing is based on what we understand. What we're trialling is things that we haven't done before by having outreach teams and using the transporter bus, and we're getting varying degrees of success because of that, because we don't necessarily know what will convince people to come to us. But actually, that whole process of engagement is proving invaluable. Even if people sort of say, actually, I really don't want one ever. So why are you wasting time? We need to know that, because what I think we're finding is that some of the people that are really reluctant to take on a vaccine may also be reluctant to engage with health services more generally. And we've got excellent data about the use of health services through something called the Whole Systems Integrated Care System that the NHS run, but we don't know too much about people who don't access those services and why they don't, and that sort of thing. And that comes through when you look at all sorts of other areas, like not just vaccine take-up, but screening issues and stuff like that. So that's part of the plan.
Councillor Lewis, yeah?
I mean, following up on that, I mean, do we offer there's quite a lot of evidence coming from the States in particular about offering vaccines to those that actually have COVID to prevent long COVID. So do we know if the health services do that?
There is a period from when you've had COVID when you cannot have a vaccine, I believe. Forgive me if I haven't got this quite right, because I'm not an expert at that, which I think is about 28 days.
You can't have the booster, but you can have a vaccine. It's a strange old system.
Okay.
I think we run on slightly different lines and guidelines to the US, but obviously you're going down.
But we're encouraged
clinical pathways.
The groups that we're targeting, particularly in this process, have been those who haven't had the first vaccine. So if we can identify who they are, then the NHS they're the front line of that proactive contact. What we're doing with the voluntary sector and the outreach team that we've got is to sort of sweep up in those areas, to have more of a physical presence, boots on the ground, if you like, to talk to people and say, have you thought about going, we've got the transporter bus here, you could have a vaccine there if you want to. And it's giving us a presence. It's early days. Well, I say it's early days. We've been doing it since the beginning of January or so. We're getting information back to help us proceed. I mean, we're not getting huge volumes through. That would be, that's not what this is going to achieve. It's not going to have a huge uptick in terms of absolute numbers, but it's giving us a valuable means of engaging with communities to understand what the issues are a bit more. That's where we are at the moment.
Thank you. Councillor Newton.
Thank you. You referred to the community champions and the fact that there are 30, which I gather from the report the funding was up to March 2021, so I assume they were actually selected at that time, and you're hoping in the future to have 40 more. And those are just, as I understand it, just for vaccinations rather than wider health, to try and address wider health inequalities. But are those spread throughout the borough, or are they concentrated in the areas which you indicated were the 10 kind of particularly high risk or low vaccination levels?
Sure, yeah, no, good question. So the timing is a little bit complicated. The first bit of money we had was for the first 3 months of 2021, and the next bit of money we've had has been for the first 3 months of 2022. So this is the way government works, I'm afraid. But what we've been able to do through H4All is to make sure that there is a programme that's been ongoing. So the relationship we have, and these are volunteers basically, so there is the overhead cost is supporting H4All to be able to set up the training, support them, and to keep this programme going. So we've got 30 who are recruited as community champions to deliver health messaging, not necessarily specifically on vaccines at that time, but obviously vaccines were a key part of it. The latest round of money has been focused on vaccines. It's called a Vaccine Community Champion Programme. So we are being required by Department for Levelling Up to report on all of the activities we are doing around vaccine encouragement and take-up, and we will do that, and we've got reporting mechanisms in place to be able to, as I say, demonstrate why we've got an intelligence-led approach to this, and what we've done as a result of that, and what the outputs of that work are, and hopefully we'll be able to demonstrate some outcomes in terms of the overall sort of vaccine levels. What's really interesting in all of this, and particularly as we move into a period of where we're being told by government that we're learning to live with COVID. Well, it's what the legacy of this work will be once we're past that stage where everybody is preoccupied with vaccines, and whatever the sort of the new norm is going to be, and I don't really know the answer to that yet. But we're now moving into 5 to 11-year-olds being eligible for vaccines. People who may be clinically extremely vulnerable being able to get a fourth vaccine at some stage. So there'll be iterations of this messaging that we will want to make sure we get out there. But we hope when the funding stops, we'll still have a cohort of 70 or so community individuals, champions, who are willing to work with us and within their communities to encourage tackling all sorts of health inequality issues. The other part of your question was, are they spread within communities? That certainly the second programme has been targeted very directly at those groups we've identified. It's not always easy, and we're quite happy to take on anyone that wants to be a champion, frankly, if they're willing to get out there and support their communities and you know, deliver some of these messages. But we have made a concerted effort to go to some of those groups that we know, or the faith venues we know that are representative in some way of the targeted communities that we need to address, and that's really where H for All are coming into their own, and we're expecting them to be able to come up with the names and the people to support that programme.
Thank you. That was I think that obviously going forward there's a significant opportunity there to try and encourage communities to have healthier lifestyles, perhaps in certain cases, because generally, I suppose, the chances of catching any virus or any sort of injury or illness is reduced if you are fairly healthy in the first place, and if you've kind of got overweight and you've got a risk of diabetes and things like that, then obviously that's going to put people at severe risk and create lots of problems within the health service and necessarily their family and community. One other thing which I think I didn't pick up from when I read through your report was that back originally there were some and I have to say that I wasn't on the committee which was involved, because the committees have all changed, I think, in that time. It's a different name of committee, but anyway, so I wasn't actually involved with the original report review. But I do remember that there were certain organisations which were kind of running and doing various things, not specifically the things which you've listed, such as I think there was one for the love of scrubs or something, which produced a lot of PPE, even for hospitals. So they produced scrub, and there were, from what I've heard, there were about 400 people involved in that, organising it, producing these. I think it was highlighted somewhere in some of the local press about it. I don't know whether you're aware of that, or whether there was, presumably not, on the basis that it may have been an opportunity to engage with a significant number of people who were community-minded at the time, at least.
I'll try and answer that. I wasn't aware of that particular initiative. Was that in Hillingdon? Were those people all in Hillingdon?
Yeah.
Really? Oh, right. Okay.
And they were distributing to, they had PPE to all of the hospitals?
I mean, there certainly was a large number of people who volunteered to be in part of the sort of the NHS responders programme that was recruited, who were supporting the NHS in a number of different areas. What I think the committee focused on in its earlier inquiry was to look at how the voluntary sector was supporting residents in dealing with the issues that residents were facing, and that's why we got into talking about food banks and some of the other areas.
Yeah, I think, having chaired that review, the main focus was around the broader voluntary sector response rather than on the health focus. So I think you're absolutely right. There were smaller groups who were doing health-related specifics. They weren't included or sort of mopped up in our review. We had probably more the better-known voluntary sector organisations that were our witnesses through that formed part of that. Just on that, I think one of the questions I wanted to ask Kevin was, and again, it's not health focused, but it's more around the whole voluntary sector, where we talked around building resilience. Should there be another significant event? Because obviously one of the things that we drew on during the review was that we have voluntary sector organisations, but when the pandemic hit, some of them were not resourced or skilled or operationally resilient to be able to operate and deliver the level of services that suddenly became demanded, where demand just completely went through the roof, as it were, and it needed the council to sort of step in and coordinate a lot of activity. I know that you commented that we're doing work in terms of communication to build up that volunteer base, which has dropped in a large number of sectors. I just wondered if we have confidence that those voluntary groups have the ability, or we are supporting them to build an operational model so that should anything happen again, they would be able to maybe react quicker or deliver their services in a more structured way than maybe they did at the start of the pandemic, where maybe there was a level of unpreparedness for what was to come.
Yeah, good question. It's not straightforward, because I think what we found, as we've experienced really in terms of the witness we saw at the part of the inquiry, was that it was the issue of scale, I think, that was the problem. Very quickly we had to deliver hundreds of food parcels almost overnight, and it was over Easter in 2020, I think. I remember this vividly, really, because we had officers literally walking around shops trying to fill up trolleys and making sure we could get food out to people that needed them. And the voluntary sector wasn't able to do that. They weren't able to do that. They were able to help that, and they supported it, and they offered volunteers that were part of it. But what we needed were people who we could bring in quite quickly, not least to answer the phones. You know, we had to mobilise our contact centre to, I think it was about 40 lines at one stage, and we trained we redeployed all of our library staff, and we used our internal auditors to do the shopping, you know, and things like this. So we as an organisation were able to be more flexible and adjustable to do that. And the voluntary sector, I think, you know, struggled with some of that scale and pace, really, in terms of needing to do things. But they were able to provide some of the more specialist stuff in terms of reaching out into the communities and the cohorts that they were particularly, you know, closer to, you know, carers and people with mental health issues and such like, to make sure they were covered in all of those processes. So in terms of where does that leave us with resilience moving forward, we've certainly talked to the groups about, well, okay, most of the conversations about resilience have been, how are you now developing your operating model to make sure that in a modern way of working, which may involve digital contacts and other things, and people having some reticence to come and participate in services and activities, how are you doing that? How are you going to survive as an organisation to make sure you can, you know, be both viable and sustainable? And that's the conversation we have as part of the sort of due diligence on the grants round application. Whether if we had another pandemic they'd be able to pick that up, it's very hard to know until we know what the full implication of the pandemic is. I think we've learnt as a council in a way that we didn't have, and across the health services as well, really, because this was all coordinated across the public sector. What we can do when we have to. I think it was quite incredible. I was at the margins of most of it, but how actually teams did come together to respond to you know, what was an unprecedented demand in services in all sorts of different directions.
Thank you. Councillor Lewis.
I think the supposition that we have actually moved from the pandemic into an epidemic is wrong. We still have just as many people contracting COVID as we had. In fact, we have more. If you look at the figures for Omicron, BA1 was really very, very high. It tailed off in BA2. But epidemiologically, it looks like we will have another wave in June. It's as close as that. And I think we're just walking into a situation that we're totally unprepared for. I don't even know whether we've got it on the risk register for further waves, because it's not. There's absolutely no. Omicron broke down into two distinct strains: BA1, which was predominant, and then BA2, which was in a minority of cases. But they were as distinct from each other as BA1 was from Delta, and the chances are it can either go more benign as the next mutation, or it can actually go far, far worse. There's no actual reason why it will necessarily go benign. So I think preparedness for another wave is vitally important. I just think the government's got it absolutely wrong, and I think we're walking into an abyss. So if you can prepare, or at least put it on the risk register, I think we should be.
I think we still have a health protection board. We've a new director of public health who's joined us since January, who is proving very helpful in us understanding a lot of these issues and taking us forward. So it's not forgotten. I don't think there's any complacency amongst the health and care sector in terms of how we're taking this forward. We are having to react to the messages from national government and adapt to reflect that. We've had all this extra investment, which I've talked about encouraging vaccinations, but the national narrative is saying to people it's all over. What I would say is that I do think we are prepared. We know what we've done before, and we're able to respond. So if we do need to ratchet up any of that activity, then I think we can do that as an organisation if we have to. I mean, hopefully we won't, but if we do, I think we now know we've got a pretty good template now through our contact centre and the community hub in terms of how we would be able to respond to, and it adjusts every time. It's never the same thing. You know, the first lockdown was all about food. The second was more about vaccines and other issues, and I think the third one, if there is one, who knows? Let's wait and see. But we've got plans in place, I think, now across the health and care sector to respond to those issues. The voluntary sector has been supported to be ready to help, and I'm sure they will step up to the plate in terms of what we're asking. But we probably still will need to lead. I don't think we can ever leave the voluntary sector to deliver this.
You can, yes.
My take on it.
Thank you. I'd encourage you to have a look at the Californian plan, which has been published, which is absolutely world-beating and world-leading in its transparency. And
thank you. Just to keep us on topics. Obviously, this is an update into the review that we did. I think we just need to be careful, mindful that we don't progress too far into creating a new review and trying to solve all of the problems between us this evening. But Councillor Edgington.
I'd hate to try and solve any problems. I'm always accused of creating them rather than solving them, I think. Anyway, yes, I was just thinking about well, there were two areas. One was, with regard to vaccinations, I believe there are quite a lot of Afghan refugees in hotels. I assume that those are all, that they have been able to be supplied and that they're mainly vaccinated and probably got a higher rate than us.
There is a process that is in place to try and make sure that everyone who is in the hotels along Bath Road and other places as Afghan refugees are receiving their vaccinations. It's led through the Home Office, and they're being done in situ, as I understand it.
Thank you. And secondly, reference is made to the food banks. Of course, potentially there could be a huge demand for food bank parcels, I would guess, later on in the year, from next month, I suppose, with the significant increase in fuel prices and inflation generally. I don't know whether you've been in contact with the food banks to try and identify whether they will be able to cope with potentially large increases in demand.
They should be able to cope back up to the levels that we saw during the pandemic, because we worked with them to try and support them to be resourced to do that. Now, as I say, they've moved back to a more of a business as usual model, which doesn't require them to be driving around doing deliveries to everybody, because people aren't required to stay indoors in quite the same way. There are a whole number of things that have happened over the last 18 months that we thought would lead to an increase in demand for the food bank. The demise of the furlough scheme, the removal of the universal credit uplift, all sorts of things like that we thought would have potentially peaked on demand. Fuel costs is another one. Yeah, it hasn't had, so far those issues have not necessarily provided the same peak in demand to food banks that we've had from people needing to isolate and as we had at the beginning of the pandemic. But they are really busy and they need to be very well supported. So I wouldn't want to give you an impression that everything was rosy. It's certainly not. But I know the people involved are doing their very best to try and meet the needs of the population as they're presented to them. So I think they do a great job. It's not easy, and they do need support. So we are in regular dialogue with them. So if we find that there is a huge upturn, then we have the opportunity to come back and say, okay, well, we need to look at this again then, which is what we did really during the pandemic. We knew that they were under severe pressure, and so we had conversations about how we could help each of the food banks with, at that time, financial support. There's also support with vehicles and other things.
Okay, I don't see anyone else. Kevin, thank you very much for your time this evening, providing an update on that. I'm sure, given the questions that members had tonight, it's a topic that we will continue to keep an eye on. Thank you. Agenda item 6. So before we move to Emma, we just need to go and just switch the microphone on. Yeah, that's fine. See that that's turned off. Just while we pause, while we sort the technology. Okay, super. So this moves us on to agenda item 6, which is update. Emma, thank you for joining us this evening in terms of corporate communications throughout the council, and this was a topic the members requested an update on, particularly in regards to media relations and press releases. I think was the initial question around it, but obviously there's a significant number of items that you've included within this report. I'm grateful for you joining us. I know you're not feeling 100%, so happy for you to provide a brief overview of the report that I think most members will have already read, and then hopefully we can take some questions after, if that's okay.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me this evening to discuss the Council's external communications, and I apologise in advance for my cough. I'll try not to cough too much. I'm sure that you've all had a chance to read the report provided, so I won't go through it verbatim. But to summarise, I've provided a general overview of the Council's external communications channels and some of the activity the corporate communication services delivered during the past year. So the channels included are, as requested, media relations. So this includes reactive media relations, where we respond to press inquiries, and proactive media relations, where we seek out positive council stories from services and produce press releases, and often selling stories to media outlets as well. Other channels include publications, so this includes a mix of print and digital to make sure we reach all residents. So that includes our residents magazine, Hillingdon People, our Hillingdon Culture and Heritage brochure, to looking digitally, our annual digital school admissions guide, the council tax guide that has just gone live after being produced last week, and our e-newsletters. Other channels include social media. So we use social media in two ways, organically, which is free, and we also use it to produce some paid-for content, and we're using that a lot more than we did previously. Our social media channels, they're continuing to grow, and we're using Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Nextdoor as platforms. Other marketing advertising materials, we produce a range of these with services across the council, and plan coordinated communications campaigns or multi-channel communications for events or smaller projects. So the channels include those that I've already mentioned, as well as website content, posters, leaflets, signage, displays, outdoor advertising, to name a few. Other channels include the website, so the council's website. So this provides details of services and initiatives, and allows residents to transact with the council. We use the channels already mentioned to signpost residents and other stakeholders to the website to transact and find out more information. And within the report, I've provided an update on the council's website transformation project. Lastly, also included in the report is video communications. So Demographic Services has provided an overview of their YouTube channel, which is primarily used to broadcast council meetings as it's being used tonight. But also Corporate Communications uses this to host videos that promote council services. So the service videos are then shared on social media, posted on the council's website where appropriate, and then included in other channels such as our e-newsletters. Sorry.
Okay, thanks very much, Emma. I'm not sure if you have a good view of the room, but happy to, if you can see, I'm happy to take questions from any members.
Yeah.
Councillor Bliss?
Yeah, I've actually got two questions. The first is, have you asked for any opposition councillors for any input into Hillingdon people, particularly for the local editions?
In terms of the what was written, we worked with services, and services provided the information of what we've done in the last 2 years in those wards, and councillors, both parties were sent the final versions to look at in terms of factual accuracy.
Okay, thank you. I don't sort of recall anything ever coming back to us, particularly in Yeading, to comment on anything.
It was sent to Councillor Curling, so Councillor Curling was sent the Labour wards.
The other question is about the YouTube views. It says that 50,000 people tuned into various council meetings in 1 year. Is that an accurate figure, and do we have a record of the average viewing times?
I'm afraid I can't answer that one as it's in the remit of democratic services, so I'm sure that Liz can have a word and report back to you on that one if that's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think we can take that away. I think we usually have some data around those for the different committees, so we can follow that up with democratic services afterwards. Councillor Edgington.
I was just so shocked by an average of 600 views for each committee meeting. Maybe one person 600 times.
A good chance to make a good impression in the next 60 seconds.
Possibly. Emma, thank you very much for the presentation and the report. Can you tell me what the structure is of your team and how many people and the budget, please?
So in terms of the staff in the team, we're 11. So there's myself, there's my deputy who is media campaigns and digital manager, 2.5 media and campaigns officers, 2 officers in publications, 2 designers, and 3 in web. So quite a small team, and our budget is actually primarily staffing. Services have their budgets for marketing, and we work with those.
Thank you. Do you think that the council follows the code of recommended practice on local authority publicity?
Yes, I believe we do. I know that there is the recommendation for Hillingdon people to be residents magazine to be produced 4 times a year, but we haven't been challenged on that one, and it's been council policy to run Hillingdon people 6 times a year.
Thank you. Could I?
Okay.
Thank you. I'm not sure that everybody agrees that it should be bi-monthly, but anyway, there are a number of issues which are referred to in that code. I think the point is that it should be objective. Any publicity should be even-handed. It should also be appropriate use of publicity, which is where the quarterly restriction comes in. And certainly, I have challenged whether it should be every 2 months. And I know that my colleagues have also challenged whether it should be every 2 months. Every 2 months. The other thing is, for example, there was a post to Facebook on the 25th of January this year, which I don't know whether you were involved in, but I don't know who approved it. But it's shown as a quote related to the safety valve agreement. It's a quote without any name of the person who has been quoted, which is a bit strange in my opinion. And it clearly was contentious, I would suggest. I wondered who had actually produced that, Emma. whether presumably you had seen it, and why it was done in that fashion.
So in terms of the deficit and the council's position, we had been mentioned on Twitter by the Labour group Twitter. We've been mentioned as in Hillingdon at Hillingdon rather than the Conservative group, and our statement provided a factual, non-political response relating to the claims that the council was going bankrupt, and we had received media inquiries as well. So we had to produce a statement to defend the council's position. So it wasn't political.
So can I come back on that? Because as I say, it was shown as a quote. It didn't have anybody's name on it. So it seems to suggest that it was from anybody in the council. It certainly wasn't my opinion. My opinion was that the council was at risk. And that's certainly what had been announced by an officer of the council to Schools Forum, and that was minuted as such.
So often with quotes, we don't always attribute them. So often we say Hillingdon Council said, which is what we did on that quote.
Sorry, it didn't say anything. It just had in quotes the quote. It didn't say council suggested this. It just had. If you go back to it,
I'll go back and have a look at it. Yeah, I'll go back and have a look.
Could I just say that the press release on the 25th of February, that's last week, about the budget speech is not even-handed. There's a quote from the Cabinet Member for Finance, and again there were contentious matters in that. So there wasn't any even-handedness, in my opinion.
In our opinion, it was even-handed. It was factual. It was non-political, and it related to the council decision and the budget that was passed on Thursday night.
Sorry, I'm hogging this, but
depends on how much of a question it is. If it's
I always ask a question. If
it's a question, yes.
Yeah.
If it's looking to prove a point or put forward a personal view, then that's slightly different. No, let you can come in after. Councillor Richard can go, and then we can.
Yes. Is there a style book which is used for Hillingdon people? For example, I see that there's been a change in the approach, at least I think there has, which is a bit unusual, in that the names of people being quoted are emboldened. And I've never seen that in normal publications.
Sorry, I missed the words in terms
emboldened. So the name and the office holder, the name and the office they are holding, when they're quoted in Hillingdon People, is emboldened. I think in the past it was only just cabinet members who were emboldened in the past, but now it seems to be almost anybody, and it seems a bit strange to me. I've never seen it in any other publication.
That's not true. So most of the quotes in Hillingdon People, when it comes to councillors, are cabinet members, and they've been presented in the same way since the magazine was redesigned. I think it was in 2016, and other quotes are presented from residents and other stakeholders, and they're written in a certain way, which has always been the style since 2016 as well. So there hasn't been a change. But if you'd like to share what you think the change has been with the clerk, I can look into it.
Councillor Lewis.
A couple of points. One is to Councillor Edgington. I mean, the budget was passed unanimously.
Councillor Lewis, questions either to Emma?
I was actually going to just comment to Emma to say, as my time as a cabinet member, I found her to be unbelievably even-handed in all her transactions. But it's not a question, but it's just a comment.
That's okay. Councillor Tuckwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question. But it certainly won't be expressing a personal opinion or making a particular point about previous external communications. What I'm interested to know, Emma, is we've got various publications that are, in various forms around the borough promoting services, facilities, highlighting and celebrating good news. I'd just be interested to know in terms of how we keep those messages fresh with everything that's very fluid and changing. What kind of feedback and how do we obtain feedback from residents who are the recipients of these messages so that we can tailor it to their needs, keep it fresh and keep it relevant, so that it is, you know, being read by our residents. So just interested to know what kind of feedback systems we have in place.
So we do have a range of feedback. So we get feedback from residents on all channels. So we use that to craft our campaigns. One of the key campaigns where we've used resident feedback is our fostering campaign. So the fostering campaign that we launched last year, the Make a Difference campaign, we shaped that using a survey where we asked current foster carers what motivated you to foster, and we asked those foster carers as well what would appeal to them visually, what pictures do you think that would motivate, and why she motivated them. And for that campaign in particular, it's stories, it's personal stories. And particularly in Hillingdon People, where we provide the personal stories of those foster carers and their motivation, and that seems to encourage other foster carers and other people to come forward to be a foster carer. So yeah, we do regularly use feedback from residents to then shape our communications. It's really important that communications is a two-way thing. So on social media, when residents ask us about things, maybe if we haven't been clear, we take those on board. We continue conversations to drive our campaigns and our materials.
Thank you, and well done for getting through that with your sniffles. But thanks for the answer.
Councillor Edgerton.
Okay. Thank you. We got interrupted. You asked me the question about, and I think it may have been just that there's been a change in the way in which other people, apart from cabinet members, have been referred to, so that you're now including quotes for them, and therefore you're emboldening their name. But it looks really strange sometimes where you see David from Uxbridge is emboldened, and then a quote from him, which just looks a bit strange in any sort of magazine, to my mind. But anyway, the point which is a bit different, is that in Hillingdon People, there seems to be a reluctance to include any reference to organisations which aren't directly involved with the council. So, for example, some charities which are doing a lot of good work in the borough have asked for something to be referred to, or something in the magazine, but have been refused. And I don't know whether there might be some way in which we could be celebrating some of these organisations which are doing a heck of a lot of good work.
So in terms of other organisations, as Kevin mentioned before, we do have the volunteers page in Hillingdon People. So those organisations that receive grant funding or are looking for volunteers, we feature them on that page. In terms of the publicity code that you spoke of before, we have to make sure that the magazine is council news primarily. So we have to make sure that it's council news, and it's not necessarily the Gazette. So sometimes we have to think about what that council link is to then make sure it's included. But we do talking on from what Kevin was talking about. The community awards that we've just won, there's a lot of community groups that are featured in that, and we've done quite a big spread in the next Hillingdon People featuring those community groups, and they'll be featured again when they receive their awards in May. And that relates to the pandemic in terms of what Kevin was also talking about.
Councillor Edgerton.
Thank you, Emma. I think if you read through the code, it does say that other organisations where the services are being provided, not necessarily funded, or indeed that they're asking for their recruiting, can be referred to in this. But have a look at that. I think it will be helpful because it would encourage other organisations to have a higher profile and perhaps be supported better within the borough.
I think in order for more organisations to be involved, there's probably two solutions, right? One is to either make the magazine bigger and have more content in each one, or increase the number of volumes that it has. I think it's difficult to put more content in by reducing the level of output. Anyone have any further questions or comments for Emma this evening? No, I don't see anyone. Emma, thank you very much for your time this evening and for going through that with the committee tonight. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Get well soon.
Thank you.
Okay, it brings on to agenda item 7, which is the forward plan. Anyone have any comments on that? Are we happy to know that? Take that as noted. Thank you. Then agenda item 8, which is our work programme. So you'll see that our meeting on the 20th of April has no content currently. I would propose, caveating the comment that Councillor Edgerton requested through the minutes in terms of HOAC, depending on what outcome comes from that, in the absence of that, I would propose that that meeting would be cancelled and we wouldn't hold that meeting without any content in the agenda. Councillor Edgerton.
Yeah, bearing in mind what we had at the last meeting, or was it the meeting before, about the cost of energy, I wonder whether we could have a report related to energy contracts to find out which way, because it seemed to be that we were doing it on a very short-term basis, effectively. Although it's a longer-term contract, it seemed to be the pricing was relatively short-term, and I wondered whether that made sense.
In terms of energy purchasing?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that, Liz, do we know which team we could go to for that?
Procurement, I guess.
Procurement and, yeah.
But it seems such a large amount. We're talking about £1 million for this building alone, before the most recent increases.
Okay. We can look at that. Okay. So with that, we will take that away. Both, everyone okay? We'll take that away and then see if that can form content for meetings. So then I will not I'll not give a thank you to everyone for their contributions for the year yet, as we may well then be back on the 20th of April. So hopefully see you then. That concludes the meeting for this evening. Thank you.